Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I was 32 when I decided to drive from Seattle to Fairbanks alone in the middle of October 2018. Just me, my beat-up Ford Explorer, and 3 weeks of vacation time I'd been hoarding at the accounting firm where I'd been grinding away for 7 years. My friends thought I was crazy. Alaska in the fall, driving solo through all that wilderness. But after catching my fiancé with my sister 2 months earlier, I needed to get as far away from civilization as possible. I wanted empty roads, mountains that made me feel small, and silence that drowned out all the noise in my head. I'd been on the road for 4 days when everything went wrong, somewhere between Tok and Delta Junction on a stretch of highway that felt like it existed outside of time itself. The gas station attendant in Tok had warned me about taking the scenic detour through some of the smaller villages. Said the roads got tricky and cell service was basically non-existent. But I was feeling adventurous, maybe even a little reckless, and I figured I had a full tank and plenty of daylight. About 3 hours into the detour, though, my GPS started acting weird, showing me in the middle of nowhere when I could clearly see buildings ahead. The village wasn't on any of my maps, just a cluster of maybe 15 houses scattered along a dirt road that branched off from the main route. No signs, no markers, nothing to indicate what this place was even called. My Explorer was making a rattling sound that had been getting worse since yesterday, and I figured I should at least ask someone how far it was to the next proper town before I ended up stranded. I pulled up to the first house that showed signs of life, smoke coming from the chimney and a porch light on, even though it was barely past 4 in the afternoon. The house was painted this faded yellow color, like butter left out in the sun too long, with green trim that was peeling in long strips. There were wind chimes everywhere, dozens of them, made from what looked like old silverware and bits of metal, but there wasn't enough wind to make them move. They just hung there, silent and strange. I knocked on the door and waited, noticing how all the curtains in the front windows were drawn tight. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard footsteps, 2 sets of them, and then the door opened to reveal an older couple, probably in their late 60s, both wearing matching knitted sweaters with reindeer patterns, even though Christmas was still 2 months away. The woman spoke first, and her voice had this sing-song quality that immediately made me think of kindergarten teachers. "Oh my goodness, honey, you look absolutely exhausted. Harold, doesn't she look exhausted?" The man, Harold apparently, nodded enthusiastically, his thick glasses reflecting the porch light in a way that made it hard to see his eyes. They were both smiling, these huge, almost theatrical smiles showing way too many teeth. The woman grabbed my arm before I could even introduce myself, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "You must come in, dear. It's getting cold and dark soon. These roads are terrible at night. Harold just made his famous moose stew, didn't you, Harold?" Harold nodded again, still silent, still smiling. I tried to explain that I just needed directions, that I had to keep driving. But she was already pulling me toward the doorway, talking over my protests about how dangerous it was for a young woman to be driving alone out here, how many people got lost and were never found. The inside of their house hit me with this wall of heat and the smell of something cooking, meat definitely, but with an undertone of something medicinal, like menthol or eucalyptus. The living room was cramped with furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved since the 70s. Orange and brown plaid couches, wood paneling on every wall, and these ceramic figurines on every surface. Hundreds of them. Little children, all of them, frozen in various poses of play. Some were holding hands, others pushing tiny ceramic swings or riding ceramic bicycles, but their faces were all wrong somehow, painted with adult expressions that didn't belong on children's features. The woman, who introduced herself as Dolores while practically shoving me into an armchair, kept talking in that sing-song voice about how lucky I was to find them, how most people drove right past their little village without even knowing it existed. That's when I noticed the windows. Every single one of them had boards nailed across the inside, painted white to match the walls, but definitely boards. Not just locked or latched, actually nailed shut with these huge industrial nails that had been hammered in at angles. The curtains hung in front of them, making it less obvious from outside, but from where I sat, I could see the heads of the nails poking through, some of them bent from being hammered too hard. My phone was in my car, plugged into the charger because the battery had been draining fast in the cold, and I suddenly felt incredibly stupid for leaving it there. Harold finally spoke for the first time, his voice raspy like he didn't use it much. "The stew needs 5 more minutes, you'll love it. Everyone who tries it wants to stay for seconds and thirds." The way he said stay made my chest tighten. Dolores clapped her hands together like he'd said something delightful and disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen, leaving me alone with Harold, who just stood there in the doorway, blocking the exit, still wearing that same unnaturally wide smile. I tried to stand up, making excuses about needing to check on my car, but Harold took a step forward, and even though he was old, he was bigger than I'd first realized, probably 6'3" and built like someone who'd done physical labor his whole life. "Car's fine," he said, pulling a keychain from his pocket and jingling it. My keychain, the one with the little rubber octopus my niece had given me for good luck. Thought it might be safer if I moved it behind the house. Animals around here, they get curious about vehicles. Sometimes they damage them. My mouth went completely dry. I hadn't heard him go outside, hadn't heard my car start. The armchair I was sitting in faced away from the front door. But even so, how had he gotten my keys? I always locked my car, it was automatic for me, muscle memory from living in Seattle. He must have seen my confusion because his smile got even wider, impossible as that seemed. "You left it running, dear. Very dangerous. Carbon monoxide and all that. I knew for a fact I hadn't left it running. I never did that, not even for quick stops." But before I could say anything, Dolores came back carrying a tray with 3 bowls of what I assumed was the moose stew. It looked wrong. The meat was gray and stringy, floating in a broth that was too thick, almost gelatinous. She set it down on the coffee table in front of me, and the smell up close was overwhelming. That medicinal scent so strong it made my eyes water. "Eat up, honey. You need your strength. It's my mother's recipe, passed down for generations. Everyone who's ever eaten it says it's unforgettable." She sat down on the couch across from me, Harold settling beside her, and they both picked up their bowls and started eating with these tiny, deliberate spoonfuls, never breaking eye contact with me. Their synchronization was unnatural. They lifted their spoons at the exact same time, chewed the exact same number of times, swallowed in unison. I picked up my spoon just to avoid making them angry, but I couldn't bring myself to actually eat anything. The consistency of the stew made my stomach turn, and underneath the overwhelming menthol smell was something else, something that reminded me of the veterinary clinic where I'd taken my cat before she died. "I really should get going," I said, setting down the spoon. "My family is expecting me in Fairbanks tonight. They'll call the police if I don't show up." It was a lie. Nobody was expecting me anywhere, but I hoped it might make them reconsider whatever they were planning. Dolores made this clicking sound with her tongue, shaking her head like I'd said something silly. "Oh, honey, there's no cell service for miles and miles. And the police? The nearest station is in Delta Junction, 3 hours away on a good day. Besides," she leaned forward and I could see that her teeth were stained dark brown, almost black at the gums. "The weather's about to turn. Harold checked the radio. Big storm coming in. You wouldn't make it a mile in that little car of yours." There was no radio in the living room that I could see, and the air outside had been perfectly still when I'd arrived. Harold stood up suddenly, his empty bowl clattering on the coffee table, and walked over to a door I hadn't noticed before, painted the same color as the wood paneling. He pulled out a ring of keys that looked ancient, some of them rusty, and started unlocking what sounded like multiple deadbolts. "Let me show you your room," he said, and my whole body went rigid. Your room. Not the guest room, not a room. Your room. Like they'd been expecting me specifically. "I'm not staying," I said, standing up so fast that some of the stew sloshed out of the bowl. "I need my keys. Right now." Harold and Dolores exchanged this look, and for just a second, their smiles dropped completely. Their faces went blank, expressionless in a way that made them look like completely different people. Then, just as quickly, the smiles snapped back into place. "Of course, dear," Dolores said, standing up and smoothing down her reindeer sweater. "But first, you should use the bathroom. It's a long drive, and like I said, the weather's turning. Harold, show her to the bathroom while I get her keys ready." Harold gestured to the door he'd just unlocked, and through it I could see a narrow hallway with no windows, no other doors except one at the very end. The hallway was lit by a single bare bulb that flickered every few seconds, and the walls were covered in what looked like scratch marks, dozens of them, at about shoulder height. I knew if I went down that hallway, I probably wouldn't come back out. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But Harold was standing between me and the front door, and Dolores had positioned herself near the kitchen, blocking the only other exit I could see. "Actually," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think I'll just hold it." That's when I remembered something. My pepper spray. It was in my jacket pocket, the little pink canister my mother had insisted I take on this trip. My jacket was still on. They hadn't asked me to take it off. I slipped my hand into my pocket, wrapping my fingers around it. Dolores took a step toward me, her smile stretching even wider, and that's when I saw something that made bile rise in my throat. She was wearing a necklace I hadn't noticed before, tucked under her sweater collar. It was a driver's license on a chain, a woman's license. The photo was too small to make out clearly, but I could see the birth date, 1988, someone my age. "Come now," she said, reaching for my arm again. "Don't be difficult. We've prepared everything so nicely for you." I pulled out the pepper spray and emptied the entire canister directly into Harold's face. He made this horrible gasping sound and stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes, and I shoved past him toward the front door. Dolores shrieked, not a normal scream, but something high-pitched and furious that barely sounded human. The door was locked with a deadbolt that needed a key from the inside, and for a terrifying second, I thought I was trapped. But then I remembered the ceramic figurines. I grabbed the heaviest one I could find, a grotesque child riding a tricycle, and smashed it through the front window. The glass shattered outward, and I could hear Dolores behind me yelling for Harold to stop me. I didn't look back. I dove through the window, feeling glass tear through my jeans, cutting my legs, but I didn't care. I hit the ground hard and ran toward where Harold said he'd moved my car. It was behind the house like he'd said, but the keys were still in the ignition. He must have been planning to move it somewhere else later. I jumped in, started it up, and floored it in reverse, not caring that I scraped the entire side against their fence. In my rearview mirror, I could see them both standing in the broken window, not chasing, just watching. They weren't smiling anymore. I drove for 2 hours straight, my legs bleeding through my jeans, until I reached Delta Junction and went straight to the police station. The officers took my statement, took photos of my injuries, and sent a unit out to check on the village. They came back saying they couldn't find it. No yellow house with green trim, no elderly couple, nothing matching my description. The road I described simply led to an abandoned mining settlement that had been empty since the 1960s. They suggested I might have been confused, maybe dehydrated or suffering from exhaustion. But I had the guts to prove it happened, and when they ran the partial license plate number I'd memorized from that necklace, they found a missing person report from 2017. A woman named Bethany Caldwell, 30 years old, last seen driving alone through Alaska. Her case is still open. I finished my trip to Fairbanks the next day, taking only main highways, and flew home instead of driving back. I still have scars on my legs from the window glass, thin white lines that remind me every day that it was real. Sometimes I search online for reports of other missing travelers in Alaska, and there are more than you'd think. I wonder how many of them stopped at that village that doesn't exist, met that couple with their too wide smiles and their boarded-up windows. I wonder if they're still waiting there for the next lost driver to ask for directions. The rental car's fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for the last 30 miles, and I was starting to sweat. It was late February, and I was driving through one of those stretches of highway in rural Montana where you could go hours without seeing another soul. I'd been on the road since noon, heading to Billings for a job interview that could finally get me out of the dead-end warehouse gig I'd been stuck in for 2 years. The GPS kept saying the nearest gas station was just ahead, but all I could see were endless pine trees and that narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the darkness. When the faded shell sign finally appeared through the windshield, barely lit by one flickering bulb, I actually let out a sigh of relief. The place looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 70s, just 2 ancient pumps and a small building with wood paneling that was peeling off in strips. I pulled up to the pump closest to the building and killed the engine. The silence hit me immediately. No traffic sounds, no wind, just that electric hum from the dying sign above. Through the grimy window of the station, I could see warm yellow light and what looked like an old guy behind the counter, reading something. I grabbed my wallet, stepped out into the cold air and tried to get the pump working. The screen was completely dead, and none of the buttons responded when I pressed them. I tried lifting the nozzle, hoping maybe it was one of those old ones where you pay inside first, but nothing happened. After a few more futile attempts, I walked toward the door, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the cracked concrete. The door chime made this weird, warped sound when I pushed inside, like the mechanism was broken. The attendant looked up from his newspaper, a heavy-set guy, probably in his 60s, wearing a faded blue uniform with a name tag I couldn't quite read from where I stood. His face had this waxy quality under the fluorescent lights, and when he smiled, only one corner of his mouth moved up. "Evening," he said, his voice raspy like he'd been chain-smoking for decades. "Pump giving you trouble?" I explained that nothing was working out there, and asked if I could just pay inside. He stood up slowly, joints popping audibly, and shook his head. "Card readers busted in here too. Been meaning to get it fixed, but the repair guy won't come out this far." He scratched at a patch of red, irritated skin on his neck, leaving white marks that slowly filled back with color. "Tell you what though, got the old manual imprinter in the back office. We can run your card through that, do it the old-fashioned way." I hesitated for a second because something about the whole setup felt weird. What gas station doesn't have any working card readers? But I needed the gas, and I couldn't exactly drive to the next station on fumes. "Sure, where's the office?" I asked, pulling out my credit card. He gestured toward a narrow hallway behind the counter, barely wide enough for one person. "Right through there, second door on the left. I'll grab the imprinter and meet you." As he said this, I heard the door chime again behind me. Another customer, I figured, but when I glanced back, the man who'd entered wasn't heading for the chips or drinks. He was just standing there by the door, hands in the pockets of a dirty canvas jacket, staring at nothing in particular. He was younger than the attendant, maybe 40, with patchy facial hair and eyes that didn't quite focus on anything. The attendant noticed me looking and quickly said, "That's just Glenn. He helps out sometimes. Don't mind him." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. Glenn hadn't moved from his spot by the door, and now he was looking directly at me with this blank expression that made my chest tight. The attendant had already started walking toward the hallway, keys jangling from his belt, and he turned back when he realized I wasn't following. "Problem?" he asked, and there was something different in his tone now, less friendly, more insistent. I gripped my card tighter and tried to think of an excuse. "Actually, you know what? I just remembered I have cash. Let me check my car real quick." The lie came out rushed, and I could tell neither of them bought it. The attendant's expression darkened, and he took a step back toward me. "Now, there's no need for that. The imprinter will just take a second. Glenn, make sure our customer doesn't leave without paying." Glenn shifted his weight, subtly centering himself in front of the door, and I noticed for the first time how large his hands were as he pulled them from his pockets. The fluorescent light above us started buzzing louder, casting harsh shadows that made both men look even more menacing. I could hear my own breathing now, quick and shallow, and I knew they could hear it too. "I really should check if I have cash first," I insisted, taking a step backward, but the attendant moved surprisingly fast for his age, closing the distance between us. Son, you're starting to hurt my feelings here. We're just trying to help you out. His breath smelled like coffee and something medicinal, and I could see tiny red veins in the whites of his eyes. Behind him, that narrow hallway seemed to stretch into complete darkness, and I had this sudden crystal-clear certainty that if I went back there, I wouldn't come out. My phone was in my pocket, but calling for help out here would take too long, assuming I even had service. I needed to do something now before they decided to stop pretending this was a normal transaction. Fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Let's do the imprinter. The attendant's face relaxed slightly, and he nodded toward the hallway again. But instead of following him, I pretended to trip over my own feet, stumbling hard into a display rack of motor oil. The bottles crashed to the floor, thick liquid spreading everywhere. And in the chaos, I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. The attendant yelled something I didn't catch, and Glenn started moving toward me. But his boots hit the oil slick and he went down hard, his head making a sickening crack against the linoleum. I didn't wait to see if he got up. I swung the extinguisher at the attendant as he lunged for me, catching him in the shoulder and spinning him into the counter. His keys flew off his belt and skittered across the floor. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might explode, but I kept moving, muscle memory from high school football kicking in as I shouldered past the attendant's grasp. Glenn was already trying to get up, oil coating his jacket, his eyes unfocused from the fall. The door was only 10 feet away, but it felt like a mile. The attendant was screaming now, not words, just this raw, furious sound that barely seemed human. I sprinted for the door, yanked it open so hard the warped chime broke completely, and ran for my car. My fingers were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. In the rearview mirror, I could see the attendant stumbling out of the station, his shoulder hanging at a weird angle, Glenn right behind him. The engine turned over on the third try and I floored it out of there, tires squealing on the cold asphalt. I didn't care that I was running on fumes. I just needed to get away from that place. The speedometer hit 90 before I forced myself to slow down, afraid I'd crash in the dark. My whole body was shaking, adrenaline making everything feel unreal, like I was watching someone else's nightmare. I drove for maybe 15 minutes on pure adrenaline before the fuel light started blinking urgently. The needle was past E now, and the engine was starting to sputter. Up ahead, I saw lights. A truck stop, massive and beautifully bright with dozens of semis parked outside. I coasted in on the last drops of gas, the engine dying just as I reached the pump. This time, everything worked perfectly. Credit card reader, receipt printer, everything normal and mundane and wonderful. Inside, the place was busy with truckers grabbing coffee and snacks, and I've never been so happy to see crowds of people. I found a corner booth and called 911, my voice still shaky as I tried to explain what had happened. The dispatcher took my information and said they'd send someone to check it out, but something in her tone made me wonder if she believed me. I bought a large coffee with trembling hands and sat there for 2 hours, afraid to get back on the road, watching every person who walked in. The next morning, after sleeping in my car at the truck stop, I searched online for news about the gas station. What I found made my skin prickle all over again. There had been 3 missing person reports in that area over the past 2 years, all travelers, all last seen heading through that stretch of highway. One woman's car had been found abandoned about 10 miles from where I'd stopped, completely out of gas. But here's the thing that really messed with me. When the police went to investigate based on my report, they found the station closed and boarded up. The owner, they said, had died 5 years ago, and the place had been shut down ever since. They thought maybe squatters were using it, setting up fake businesses to rob travelers, but they found no evidence of recent activity, no fresh oil spills, no signs of struggle, nothing. Even the old shell sign was completely dark and covered in rust, like it hadn't worked in years. The cops theorized that criminals were probably monitoring the highway, waiting for vulnerable targets running low on fuel, then lighting up the station just enough to lure people in. They found evidence of a generator hidden in the woods behind the building and fresh tire tracks from at least 2 different vehicles. What they couldn't explain was how I'd managed to escape when others hadn't, or where the men had gone so quickly after I'd fled. The detective I spoke with, a woman named Brennan, told me I was lucky. Most people who stop at fake setups like that don't get the chance to tell their story. She said Glenn and the older man were probably part of a larger operation. Maybe trafficking, maybe organ harvesting, maybe just robbery gone wrong too many times. They never found them, though they did discover makeshift living quarters in the basement of the station. Sleeping bags, food wrappers, empty prescription bottles, and disturbingly, several different sets of car keys and multiple driver's licenses, all from different states, all from people reported missing. I never made it to that job interview in Billings. Called them from the truck stop and said I'd had a family emergency, which felt true enough. These days, I work locally and avoid road trips altogether. When I absolutely have to drive somewhere far, I fill up the tank obsessively, never letting it drop below half. Sometimes I dream about that narrow hallway behind the counter, wondering what was really waiting in that back room. What would have happened if I'd followed the attendant into the darkness? The detective called me a few months later to say they'd arrested 2 men matching my description in Wyoming, caught trying the same setup at another abandoned station. But when they showed me the mugshots, the faces were different. Similar age and build, but definitely not the same men. That's when I realized this wasn't just 2 guys running a scam. This was something bigger, organized, with multiple teams working the isolated highways. I testified at the trial for the Wyoming guys, and they got 15 years each, but I know there are others out there. The attendant with the waxy face and Glenn with his empty stare, they're probably at some other forgotten gas station right now, waiting for the next car running on empty, practicing their lines about broken card readers and back offices. If you're ever driving through nowhere and your tank is getting low, just keep driving. Run out of gas on the highway if you have to. Whatever you do, don't stop at that isolated station with the flickering sign, no matter how desperate you are. Some risks just aren't worth taking. Last winter, I was drowning in credit card debt and needed to cut expenses fast. When I found a rental listing for a cabin 40 miles outside Anchorage for just $400 a month, I jumped on it without thinking twice. The landlord, Mr. Garrison, warned me it was isolated. No neighbors for miles, rough dirt road, generator power only. But that's exactly what I needed. A place to disappear for a few months, work my remote job, and save every penny I could. I packed my Subaru with everything essential: laptop, winter clothes, canned goods, and drove out there on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, following his hand-drawn map because GPS stopped working 20 miles before the turnoff. The cabin was smaller than it looked in photos, just one room with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom addition, but it had a wood stove and thick walls that kept the cold out better than my apartment in the city ever did. That first week I settled into a routine quickly. Coffee at sunrise, 8 hours of data entry on my laptop, instant ramen or canned soup for dinner, then reading by lantern light until I fell asleep. The silence was incredible, almost oppressive at first. Just the wind through the pines and occasional crack of ice breaking somewhere in the darkness. By day 4, I'd stopped jumping at every little sound. By day 7, I was actually sleeping through the night, something I hadn't done in years. The isolation felt like medicine, like I was finally healing from all the noise and stress of regular life. Then things started disappearing. Just small stuff at first. I thought I was being forgetful, stressed from work deadlines. A can of beef stew I'd sworn I'd put in the cupboard, gone. My backup flashlight that I kept by the door, nowhere to be found. A pair of wool socks I'd left drying by the stove, vanished. I blamed myself, figured I was more scattered than usual, maybe putting things in weird places while my mind was elsewhere. But then my winter boots disappeared from right beside the bed where I always kept them, and I knew something wasn't right. Those boots were my lifeline out here. heavy-duty sorrels that cost me $200. I tore the cabin apart looking for them, checked the car, even walked around outside in my sneakers thinking maybe I'd left them on the porch in some kind of mental fog. The morning everything changed was a Wednesday, crisp and bright with fresh snow that had fallen overnight. I was making coffee when I noticed the crawl space trap door was open, just slightly, maybe 3 inches, but definitely open. That door was in the floor near the back corner, painted the same faded brown as the floorboards, and I'd never touched it, never even thought about it really. But there in the fresh layer of dust around it were footprints, clear as day, leading from the trap door to my kitchen area and back. Not my footprints, these were bigger, made by boots with a deep tread pattern. My whole body went rigid staring at those prints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Someone had been inside my cabin, had come up through that trapdoor while I was sleeping just feet away. I grabbed a kitchen knife and my phone, though I knew there was no signal out here. The trapdoor felt heavier than it should have when I pulled it fully open, and the smell that came up made me gag. Body odor, urine, something rotting. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it down into the darkness. The crawl space was maybe 4 feet high, dirt floor, stone foundation walls. At first I just saw pipes and cobwebs, some old lumber scraps. Then my light hit the far corner and I saw it. A makeshift bed of moving blankets and what looked like foam padding ripped from car seats. Empty food cans scattered around, some still fresh with residue. A milk crate with more stuff inside. I could see the red fleece of my missing socks poking out the top. My first instinct was to run, just get in my car and drive, never come back. But anger overtook the fear. This was my space, I was paying rent, and some creep had been living under me like some kind of parasite. I yelled down into the hole, told whoever was down there to get out right now or I was calling the police. Nothing. No movement, no sound. I grabbed a broom and poked at the bedding, half expecting someone to grab it, but it just collapsed into itself. That's when I saw the notebook, spiral-bound and water-stained, tucked between the blankets. I knew I shouldn't touch it, knew I should just leave everything for the cops, but I had to know who'd been down there, had to understand what kind of person does this. The notebook was filled with observations about me. Pages and pages in cramped handwriting. When I woke up, when I went to bed, what I cooked, when I showered. She takes long showers on Sunday. She talks in her sleep about someone named Kevin. She cries sometimes when she thinks no one can hear. This person had been watching me, studying me, for who knows how long. Some entries had sketches too, the back of my head while I worked at my laptop, my silhouette against the window. One page just had a list of my belongings with check marks next to items, the stolen things. But what made my knees buckle was an entry from 3 days ago. She's prettier up close. Stood by her bed for 20 minutes last night. She never woke up. I scrambled up the ladder out of that crawl space so fast I scraped my palms bloody. Called Mr. Garrison from my car with the doors locked, driving toward town to get signal. He acted shocked, said he'd call the sheriff right away, that nothing like this had ever happened before. But something in his voice sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. While I waited at a diner in town for the sheriff, I searched online for anything about the cabin, previous renters, any incidents. Found a forum post from 2017, a woman describing the exact same thing, same cabin, same crawl space situation. Another from 2015, a college student who'd rented it for a semester. Mr. Garrison had told them all the same thing, acted just as surprised. The sheriff, when he finally showed up 2 hours later, just shrugged and said, squatters were common in remote rentals, that I should have checked the crawl space when I moved in. They went back to the cabin with me that afternoon, 2 deputies who looked bored before we even got there. The crawl space was empty, completely cleaned out, no bedding, no cans, no notebook, nothing. Even the smell was gone, just cold earth and old wood. The deputies exchanged looks like I was wasting their time, suggested maybe I'd seen a raccoon nest or something. I showed them the photos I'd taken on my phone, but they were blurry, could have been anything in that dark space. One deputy did note the footprints, took a half-hearted picture, said they'd file a report. They left me there as the sun was setting, told me to call if anything else happened, but I could tell they thought I was just another city person spooked by country living. I couldn't stay there another night, not after reading that notebook, not after knowing someone had stood over my bed. Packed everything I could fit in my car in under an hour, left the rest behind. As I was loading the last box, I saw him, just for a second, at the tree line about 50 yards away. Tall, wearing a thick canvas jacket and a wool cap pulled low, standing perfectly still between two pines. When I looked directly at him, he stepped backward into the shadows, smooth and practiced like he'd done it 1,000 times. I didn't run, didn't scream, just got in my car and drove away steady and calm, watching the mirrors the whole way. At the first gas station, I called Mr. Garrison and told him I was breaking the lease, that he could keep my deposit, that I'd mail the keys. He didn't argue, didn't even ask why, just said he understood and hung up. A week later, staying at a motel outside Anchorage while I looked for a new place, I got a call from an unknown number. It was a woman named Janet. Said she'd seen my post on the rental forum warning people about the cabin. She'd rented it in 2016, had the exact same experience, but she'd done more digging than me. The person in the crawl space wasn't some random squatter. It was Mr. Garrison's brother, Eugene. He'd been living on the property for years, had some kind of mental disability after a logging accident. Mr. Garrison couldn't afford proper care for him, so he'd worked out this sick arrangement. Eugene lived in a shed deeper in the woods during summer, but in winter, when renters came for the cheap seasonal rate, he'd move into the crawl space. Mr. Garrison would rent to single women specifically, people he thought wouldn't cause trouble, would just leave like we all did. Janet had gone to the state police, filed reports, even contacted a lawyer, but nothing ever came of it. Eugene wasn't technically dangerous, had never physically hurt anyone, and Mr. Garrison always claimed ignorance, said his brother must have been sneaking in without his knowledge. The cabin is still listed online. I checked last month. Same photos, same low winter rate, same promise of peaceful isolation. Sometimes I wonder about the woman renting it now, if she's noticed her things going missing yet, if she's heard the floors creak at night, if she knows about the trap door. I left reviews on every rental site I could find, but they keep getting taken down. All I can do is post my story wherever people will listen, hoping someone reads it before they make the same mistake. That face in the trees still visits my dreams sometimes, patient and still, just watching and waiting for something I'll never understand. I spent 8 years working the oil fields up in Alaska. And most folks don't realize how isolated those roads can get between the North Slope and Anchorage. It was early March 2015, and I was heading home after a 3-week rotation at Prudhoe Bay, driving my company-issued Ford F-350 through one of those stretches where you might not see another vehicle for hours. The temperature gauge on my dashboard read -22, and the heater was cranked so high that the windows kept fogging up despite the defroster running full blast. I remember I had just passed the last service station about 40 miles back, thinking about the leftover pizza waiting in my freezer at home, and how good it would feel to sleep in my own bed again. The radio had lost signal maybe an hour earlier, so it was just me, the hum of the engine, and that endless white landscape stretching out on both sides of the Dalton Highway. Around 4 in the afternoon, with the sun already getting low on the horizon and painting everything this weird orange-gray color, I spotted a dark blue sedan pulled off on the shoulder about a quarter mile ahead. The hazard lights were blinking in that steady rhythm that always makes you slow down and take notice, especially out there where breaking down could mean freezing to death if nobody stops to help. As I got closer, I could see it was a newer model Toyota Camry, which struck me as odd because most people who drive that route regularly know better than to take a sedan through those conditions. The car was sitting at an angle, like maybe they'd slid off the road and couldn't get traction to pull back onto the pavement. Through my windshield, I could make out someone in the driver's seat, and they appeared to be waving their arm out the window. That universal gesture of someone who desperately needs help. Now, after 8 years of driving these roads, you develop a kind of code about stopping to help people. You always do it, because next time it could be you out there with a dead battery or a blown tire, slowly turning into a human popsicle while you wait for someone with a conscience to show up. But you also learn to be smart about it. You keep your engine running. You park at an angle that gives you an escape route, and you size up the situation before you fully commit. I eased off the gas and started pulling over about 50 feet behind the Camry, leaving plenty of room to maneuver if I needed to. My headlights lit up the back of their car, and I noticed the license plate was caked with so much ice and road grime that I couldn't read it, though I could tell it wasn't an Alaska plate by the color scheme. Something in my gut tightened a little at that, but I pushed it aside. Lots of people drive up from the lower 48 for work. I grabbed my heavy work gloves from the center console and was just reaching for the door handle when I caught movement in my side mirror. A white Chevy Silverado was coming up behind me, moving slower than normal traffic would, maybe doing 35 in a 65 zone. The weird thing was, I hadn't seen any headlights behind me for the last hour, and this truck seemed to appear out of nowhere. It pulled up close behind me, way closer than anyone would normally park in a roadside assistance situation, maybe 10 feet from my bumper. The driver kept the engine running but turned off the headlights, leaving just the parking lights on, which made the whole truck look like some kind of ghost ship in my mirrors. I sat there for a second, hand still on the door handle, trying to process why this felt wrong. That's when I noticed that 2 people were getting out of the Camry up ahead. Both men, both wearing identical black Carhartt jackets and work boots, moving with this weird purposeful stride toward my truck. The way they walked wasn't right. Nobody who just broke down in -20 weather moves that smoothly, that coordinated. They weren't hunched against the cold or hurrying to explain their situation like stranded motorists always do. The one from the driver's side was tall, maybe 6'3", with a thick brown beard that covered most of his face and these narrow eyes that stayed locked on my truck as he approached. The passenger was shorter but built like a brick wall, shoulders so wide he had to turn sideways to get out of the Camry, and he had this habit of rolling his neck every few steps like he was loosening up for something. They split up as they walked, the tall one heading toward my driver's side while the shorter one angled toward the passenger side. And that's when every alarm bell in my head started screaming. I glanced in my rear view and saw the driver of the Silverado getting out too. A younger guy wearing a baseball cap pulled low, and the same type of black Carhartt jacket. He wasn't rushing either, just walking up along the driver's side of my truck with his hands in his pockets. My brain went into this weird hyper-aware state where time seemed to slow down, and I started cataloging everything around me. The tall, bearded guy was about 15 feet from my door now, and I could see he was wearing latex gloves under his work gloves, just a flash of blue at his wrists. The stocky one on the passenger side had something in his right hand, held low against his leg where he probably thought I couldn't see it, maybe a crowbar or a pipe. The guy from the Silverado had positioned himself at my blind spot, where I'd have to turn completely around to see him properly. None of them were saying anything. No, "Hey buddy, thanks for stopping," or "Can you help us out?" Just this steady, silent approach. My grandfather used to tell me that when you're hunting, the moment before you spring the trap is when everything goes quiet, and that's exactly what this felt like. I made a decision in about half a second. I slammed the truck into drive and floored it, shooting forward so fast that my tires spun on the ice for a moment before catching. The tall, bearded guy lunged for my door handle just as I pulled away, and I heard his fist slam against the side of my truck bed with this metallic boom that echoed in the cold air. In my mirrors, I could see all 3 of them running back to their vehicles, not panicked but quick and efficient, like they'd practiced this before and had a plan B ready to go. I kept the accelerator pushed down, doing about 70 on a road where 50 would be pushing it in these conditions, my truck fishtailing slightly every time I hit a patch of black ice. The Camry's engine roared to life behind me, so much for being broken down, and those hazard lights switched off immediately, replaced by high beams that lit up the inside of my cab like a spotlight. The Silverado was right behind them, and within 30 seconds, both vehicles were gaining on me fast. My F-350 was built for hauling heavy loads, not for winning races, and on this icy road, I couldn't risk going much faster without ending up in a ditch. They stayed on me for the next 12 miles, riding so close that I could see the tall guy's face in my mirror when the Camry would pull alongside trying to pass. He had the passenger window down despite the freezing temperature, and I saw him make a gesture at me to pull over, except his other hand was holding what looked like a black tactical baton, the expandable kind that security guards carry. Every time they tried to get alongside me, I'd drift into the center line to block them, and when they'd fall back, the Silverado would surge forward and try the same move on the other side. It was like some nightmare version of a NASCAR race, except the stakes were whatever these guys had planned for me if they got me stopped. I kept thinking about how perfectly they'd set it up. The broken-down car routine, the spot they'd chosen with no cell service and no traffic, the way they'd worked together without speaking. This wasn't their first time, and I definitely wasn't going to be their last if I could help it. Then I remembered something that might save me. There was a way station about 8 miles ahead that sometimes had state troopers hanging around, even when it was officially closed. It was my only shot at finding help before these guys either ran me off the road or waited for me to run out of gas. I reached over to my CB radio with one hand while trying to keep the truck steady with the other, switching to channel 19 and shouting out a mayday call to any truckers who might be in range. Static. Nothing but static and the sound of engines behind me getting closer. The Camry made another aggressive move, pulling up so close to my driver's side that I could have reached out and touched their mirror. The bearded guy was leaning out the window now, shouting something I couldn't hear over the wind. And that's when I saw the younger guy in the back seat pulling something from a bag. I didn't wait to see what it was. I yanked the wheel hard right and then back left, sending up a cloud of snow and gravel that sprayed across their windshield. The way station appeared through the dim twilight like a beacon, its overhead light still on, even though the scales were clearly closed. I didn't care if it was empty. There were cameras there, bright lights, and maybe someone would see what was happening on the surveillance footage, even if they couldn't help me right now. I took the exit ramp doing 50, my truck sliding sideways for a terrifying moment before the tires grabbed asphalt again. Behind me, the Camry tried to follow but took the turn too fast, spinning out and ending up backwards in the snowbank beside the ramp. The Silverado managed better, staying right on my tail as I skidded to a stop in front of the way station building. I leaned on my horn, holding it down in long, desperate blasts while flashing my high beams at the dark windows of the office. The Silverado had stopped about 30 feet away, engine running, and I could see the driver talking on a phone while staring straight at me. We sat there in this weird standoff for maybe 30 seconds before I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens in the distance getting louder. The driver of the Silverado must have heard them too because he suddenly threw the truck in reverse, backed up fast, and peeled out of the way station, heading back toward the highway. Through my side mirror, I watched him stop briefly at the bottom of the ramp where the Camry was stuck, and two figures jumped out of the sedan and into the truck bed before it sped off northbound, the opposite direction from where we'd come. Within 2 minutes, a state trooper's Tahoe came screaming into the way station, lights blazing, followed closely by another unit. I practically fell out of my truck when the first officer approached, my legs shaking so bad from adrenaline that I had to lean against the door to stay upright. The trooper, a woman with sergeant stripes and eyes that had seen too much of this kind of thing, took one look at my face and immediately called for additional units to search for the vehicles I described. They never caught them. The troopers found the Camry abandoned about 20 miles north, wiped clean, and with stolen plates from a vehicle in Wasilla. The VIN had been scratched off, and the only thing left inside was a roll of duct tape and some zip ties under the passenger seat that made my stomach turn when the sergeant told me about it. Turns out, there had been 3 similar incidents in the past 2 months. Oil field workers driving alone getting ambushed on remote stretches of highway. 2 of them weren't as lucky as me, One guy got robbed of his truck and all his equipment, left on the roadside with a concussion, and another was found a week after he went missing. His vehicle burned out in a ravine 50 miles from where he was supposedly heading. The trooper told me I was smart to run when I did, that these guys were probably part of a crew targeting workers they knew would be carrying cash and valuable tools after long rotations. I spent 4 hours at the trooper station giving my statement, drinking terrible coffee, and trying to stop my hands from trembling every time I thought about what could have happened if I'd actually gotten out to help. Everyone always warns you about hiking alone, but when you're 21 and training for a marathon, you get cocky about your abilities. It was a Saturday in early September 2022, and I was starting my second year at the University of Alaska Anchorage, living in a cramped dorm room that smelled perpetually of instant ramen and my roommate's vanilla body spray. I'd been stressed about organic chemistry and needed to clear my head. So around 3 p.m., I grabbed my purple water bottle, threw on my beat-up Nikes, and headed out to the flat-top mountain trail near Chugach State Park. The parking lot had maybe 6 or 7 cars scattered around, which seemed perfect. Busy enough to feel safe, empty enough to enjoy nature without crowds. I remember thinking how crisp the air felt, that perfect Alaska autumn temperature where you need a light jacket but end up tying it around your waist after 10 minutes of hiking. The first hour passed exactly how I needed it to. My breathing settled into that meditative rhythm, and I stopped mentally reviewing molecular structures for once. Around 4:30 p.m., I paused at a scenic overlook to drink some water and take a photo of the valley below, all golden and rust-colored from the changing birch trees. That's when I first noticed him. A guy in a dark green jacket, maybe 200 feet behind me on the trail, standing completely still. Nothing immediately alarming about that. People stop to catch their breath all the time, but something about his posture made me take note. He wasn't looking at the view or checking his phone or drinking water. He was just standing there, facing my direction, hands loose at his sides. I continued up the trail, telling myself I was being paranoid, that he was probably just out of shape and needed a longer break than most hikers. About 15 minutes later, I reached a steeper section with these natural rock steps, and my thighs were burning something fierce. I stopped again, this time sitting on a flat boulder to really hydrate and let my muscles recover. I pretended to mess with my phone, but really I was watching the trail behind me. Sure enough, there he was again, same distance, same weird stillness. The jacket looked too heavy for hiking, more like something you'd wear to a construction site, and his jeans seemed out of place on a trail. When I stood up to continue, he immediately started walking too. My chest tightened, but I told myself maybe we just had similar fitness levels, similar pace. Lots of people hike this trail. The sun was getting lower though, painting longer shadows across the path, and I realized I'd been out longer than planned. I decided to test it. At the next fork, instead of taking the longer loop I'd intended, I veered onto a shorter connecting trail that would cut back toward the parking area. I made the turn casual, like I was just exploring, even stopped to pretend to read the trail marker. From my peripheral vision, I watched him approach the same fork. He didn't hesitate, didn't check the sign, just turned exactly where I had turned. That's when my body kicked into a different gear. Not quite panic, but that sharp alertness where every sound becomes amplified. The trail was narrower here, more enclosed by spruce trees that blocked out most of the dimming sunlight. I could hear his footsteps now, steady and deliberate on the gravelly path. Not rushing, but not falling behind either. Always maintaining that same unsettling distance. Like he'd calculated the exact space that would keep me aware of him without seeming obviously threatening. I picked up my pace without making it obvious, focusing on keeping my breathing controlled even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. The parking lot was maybe 20 minutes away if I maintained this speed. I pulled out my phone to check the time, 5:47 p.m., and noticed I had no signal. Of course, the trees were thicker here, and Chugach is notorious for dead zones. I thought about recording a video just in case, but my battery was at 12%. I'd been stupid, hadn't charged it before leaving campus. Behind me, his footsteps matched my increased pace perfectly. Not jogging, just longer strides that ate up the ground between us whenever I tried to create more distance. I risked a glance back, making it seem like I was checking the trail difficulty. He was closer now, maybe 100 feet, and for the first time I could make out his face. Weathered, maybe mid-40s, with this patchy gray beard and eyes that didn't look away when I turned. He just kept walking toward me with this blank, focused expression, like I was a task he needed to complete. The trail curved ahead, disappearing behind a cluster of Devil's Club and alders, and I knew once I rounded that bend, we'd be completely out of sight from the main trail system. My mind started racing through options. Run. But if he chased me and caught up, we'd be alone in the woods with fading light. Keep walking and hope someone else showed up? Fat chance this late in the day. I remembered passing an older couple going the opposite direction maybe 40 minutes ago, but they'd probably already reached their car and left. Then I heard it, his pace quickening, the steady crunch, crunch, crunch of gravel becoming more rapid. Not quite running, but that purposeful stride when someone's made a decision. I didn't turn around this time. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to move, to get away from this trail that suddenly felt like a trap, designed specifically for situations like this. I made a split-second decision and broke into a run, not caring anymore about seeming rude or paranoid. The second my feet started pounding faster, I heard him break into a run too. Heavy, determined footfalls that echoed through the trees. Pure adrenaline flooded my system as I sprinted down the narrow trail, branches whipping past my face, my ankles rolling dangerously on loose rocks. The parking lot had to be close, maybe 15 minutes at a normal pace, but I had no idea how long I could maintain this speed. His breathing was audible now, ragged but steady, and he was gaining on me. Those longer legs, that bigger stride. Physics wasn't on my side. I screamed once, hoping maybe someone, anyone, might be within earshot. But the sound seemed to get swallowed by the dense forest. My purple water bottle flew out of my side pocket, bouncing somewhere behind me, and I heard him stumble over it, cursing. The first sound he'd made this entire time. His voice was rough, angry, like I'd personally offended him by running. The trail split again up ahead, and I remembered from the map that the left path was more direct but steeper, while the right curved around but stayed relatively flat. Without thinking, I veered left, using my hands to scramble up a particularly steep section, dirt and small rocks cascading behind me. My legs were screaming. My lungs felt like they were full of broken glass, but I kept pushing. Then I heard him slip on the loose gravel I'd displaced, heard his body hit the ground hard with a grunt of pain. I didn't look back, just kept climbing, using exposed roots as handholds, my fingernails breaking against the rough bark. The trees were thinning out, and through gaps in the canopy I could see the orange glow of the parking lot lights flickering on in the early dusk. They were maybe 300 yards away, but it might as well have been 3 miles with how my legs were shaking. Behind me I could hear him getting up, hear the rage in his movements as he started climbing again, slower now but still coming. I burst through the last line of trees into the parking area, my vision blurry from exhaustion and tears I didn't realize were streaming down my face. There were 2 cars besides mine, a white pickup truck and a red sedan I hadn't noticed earlier. I ran straight for the pickup, slamming my fists against the driver's window, screaming for help. A startled man in his 60s jerked back, then quickly unlocked his door when he saw my face. "Please," I gasped. "There's a man chasing me. He's been following me for miles." The older man immediately got out, all 6 feet of him, wearing a faded Marine's cap and a flannel shirt. His wife was already on her phone calling 911. Just then, my pursuer emerged from the tree line, stopping abruptly when he saw I wasn't alone anymore. For a moment, we all just stood there in this surreal standoff, him breathing heavily about 50 feet away, grass and dirt staining his jeans from the fall, his eyes darting between me and the older couple. The Marine veteran stepped forward, putting himself between me and the man in the green jacket. "You need to back away right now," he said, his voice carrying that unmistakable tone of someone who's used to being obeyed. The pursuer raised his hand slightly, attempting this innocent expression that made my stomach turn. "Just hiking," he said, his voice higher than I'd expected, almost whiny. Don't know what she's talking about. But his eyes kept flicking to me with this horrible intensity, like he was memorizing my face. The old man's wife called out that state troopers were 8 minutes away. That seemed to make the decision for him. Without another word, he turned and jogged toward a beat-up gray Ford Ranger on the far side of the lot, one I hadn't noticed tucked between the trees. As he drove past us to exit, he slowed down just enough to stare at me through his passenger window. I'll never forget that look, not angry anymore, but calculating, like he was filing information away for later. The Marine wrote down his license plate, but when the troopers ran it 20 minutes later, the truck had been reported stolen from Anchorage 2 days earlier. The state troopers took my statement 3 times, had me describe every detail about him. The patchy beard, weathered skin, approximately 5'10", maybe 180 pounds, that heavy green jacket that looked like it came from an army surplus store. They found my purple water bottle on the trail the next day when they searched the area, along with fresh cigarette butts at several spots where he'd been watching me, spots I hadn't even noticed him stopping at. The detective told me he'd been hunting me, that the behavior pattern suggested someone experienced at stalking. They never caught him. The stolen truck was found abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Eagle River 3 days later, wiped clean. For weeks afterward, I'd see men in green jackets and feel my whole body seize up. I switched to running on the university's indoor track, stopped hiking alone, bought pepper spray that I carried everywhere. My roommate said I started talking in my sleep, always the same phrase, "He's still coming." The part that haunts me most happened about a month later. I was at a coffee shop near campus, sitting by the window with my laptop, when I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. My car was right there in view, and I hadn't seen anyone approach it. The note just had one line written in block letters: "You run fast but not far enough." Campus security reviewed footage from nearby cameras but couldn't find anything useful. Too many blind spots, too many people coming and going. I ended up transferring to the University of Washington that spring, told everyone it was for their better biology program. The truth is, I couldn't stay in Alaska knowing he was still out there, knowing he'd taken time to find me again, just to let me know he could. I still hike sometimes, but only in large groups, and I've never been able to enjoy it the same way. That meditative rhythm I used to find on trails is gone, replaced by this constant awareness of footsteps, of distances, of who might be watching from behind the trees. The temperature was dropping fast that afternoon in November 2023, and I should have known better than to make the drive alone from Anchorage to Homer. I was 26, had just walked out on my job at the veterinary clinic after catching my boyfriend with my roommate, and all I wanted was to spend Thanksgiving with my cousin Natalie and forget everything about my disaster of a life. 7 hours of highway through the Kenai Peninsula seemed like the perfect escape. Just me, my beat-up Ford Explorer, and 300 miles of forest and mountains to clear my head. I'd packed light, thrown some snacks and water bottles in a backpack, grabbed my phone charger, and hit the road around 10 in the morning. The weather report had mentioned possible snow flurries, but nothing serious, and I figured if truckers were still running the route, I'd be fine. That kind of thinking will get you killed up here, but I was too wrapped up in my own problems to pay attention to what the wilderness was trying to tell me. About 4 hours into the drive, somewhere between Cooper Landing and Ninilchik, my lower back started cramping from sitting in the same position for too long. The sky had turned that strange winter gray that makes 3 in the afternoon feel like dusk, and I'd been following the same pair of red taillights for the past hour, using them as a guide through the curves. When I saw the rest area sign, one of those small pullouts with just a couple of picnic tables and an outhouse, I figured it was the perfect spot to walk around for a few minutes. Mile marker 127, according to the little green sign, about halfway to Homer. I pulled into the empty gravel lot, put the Explorer in park, and checked my phone out of habit. 2:47 p.m., and surprisingly, I had 3 bars of signal. I fired off a quick text to my sister Amy. Stopping to stretch at mile marker 127, halfway there. She'd been worried about me making the drive alone, especially with everything I'd been going through, so I figured I'd let her know I was doing okay. The rest area was completely deserted, which wasn't unusual for that time of year. Just my Explorer sitting there in the gravel, surrounded by towering spruce trees that seemed to lean in closer than they should. I grabbed my water bottle and stepped out into the cold, and the silence hit me immediately. That complete absence of sound you only get in remote places, where even your own breathing seems too loud. The air had that sharp, metallic taste that comes before snow, and I could see my breath forming little clouds that disappeared into the gray afternoon. I walked over to the wooden information board they had set up near the picnic tables, the kind with a faded map behind scratched plexiglass and warnings about bears that nobody ever reads. There were some old flyers tacked to the side, missing dog from August, community potluck from July, stuff like that. But there was also a newer one, barely weathered, with a photo of a young woman about my age. Missing. Stephanie Walsh, last seen November 3rd, traveling southbound on Sterling Highway. Louis, 2 weeks ago. I remember staring at her photo and thinking how much she looked like me. Same long brown hair, same general build, even wore the same kind of puffy North Face jacket I had on. The flyer said she'd been driving to visit family in Soldotna when she disappeared, and her car was found at a rest stop with everything still inside. No signs of struggle, no explanation, just gone. I took a photo of the flyer with my phone. Not really sure why. Maybe just that uncomfortable recognition when you see someone who could be your sister or your college roommate plastered on a missing poster. That's when I noticed the other flyers underneath, older ones that had been partially covered. 3 more missing persons, all young women, all last seen along this same stretch of highway over the past 2 years. Each one had that same detail that made my chest tighten. Cars found at rest areas, belongings undisturbed, no sign of where they'd gone. The dates were spread out enough that it probably hadn't made the news as a pattern, but standing there in that empty rest area, I suddenly felt very exposed. I walked quickly back to my Explorer, trying to shake off the paranoid feeling creeping up my spine. The smart thing would have been to get in, lock the doors, and drive straight to Homer without stopping again. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something that made me pause, the sound of an engine, but not coming from the highway. It was coming from behind the tree line, maybe 30 yards into the woods, the low rumble of a truck idling. There was an old logging road back there. I could see the gap in the trees where it curved away from the rest area. But why would anyone be parked back there in the middle of winter? The engine cut off, and in the silence that followed, I heard a car door slam. Then another, then voices, 2 men, their words muffled by distance and trees, but clearly having some kind of argument. One voice was deeper, agitated, saying something about not here and too risky, while the other was higher, more nervous, mentioning something about the schedule and she already saw. My hand was still on the door handle, every instinct screaming at me to get in and leave, but my legs weren't cooperating. The voices were getting clearer, like they were walking toward the rest area, and I could hear branches snapping under heavy boots. That's when I saw him. A man in a faded brown Carhartt jacket stepping out from the tree line about 20 yards away, carrying what looked like a rolled-up tarp under one arm. He was maybe 45, weathered face with a scraggly beard that had gone gray in patches, and he had this way of walking that reminded me of my uncle when he came back from hunting. Deliberate, careful, like he was trying not to spook something. He hadn't seen me yet, was looking back toward the trees and saying something to whoever was still back there. But then he turned, and our eyes met across that empty gravel lot. He didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't do any of those normal things people do when they accidentally make eye contact. He just stared at me with these flat, calculating eyes, like he was working through a problem in his head, and I was part of the equation. "Afternoon," he finally called out, his voice carrying that forced friendliness that made my stomach clench. He started walking toward me, not rushing, but steady, and I noticed how he kept the tarp tucked against his side like he didn't want me to get a good look at it. There were dark stains on the edges that could have been mud or oil or something else entirely. "Car trouble?" he asked, getting closer, and I could smell him now. Cigarettes and diesel fuel and something underneath that reminded me of the veterinary clinic after we'd had to put down large animals. That specific smell that clings to your clothes. I managed to shake my head, my fingers finally working enough to pull the door handle. "Just stretching my legs," I said, surprised at how normal my voice sounded. "Long drive to Homer." His expression shifted slightly when I mentioned Homer, and he glanced back toward the trees where I could now see another figure emerging. Younger, skinnier, wearing one of those reflective vests that highway workers use. The younger one was carrying something too, a black duffel bag that looked heavy from the way he kept switching hands. He had this twitchy energy about him, kept looking between me and the older man like he was waiting for some kind of signal. "Homer's a long way," the older man said, taking another step closer. Close enough now that I could see the dirt caked under his fingernails and a fresh scratch across his left cheek that looked like someone had fought back. "Dangerous drive this time of year. Ice and all. Sometimes people don't make it where they're going." The younger one laughed at that, this high, nervous giggle that made my skin prickle. I yanked my door open and slid into the driver's seat, my hands fumbling with the keys. The older man moved faster than I expected for his size, suddenly right there at my window, one hand pressed against the glass. "We could follow you," he said, and his breath fogged up the window between us. "Make sure you get there safe. Wouldn't want you ending up like those girls on the flyers." The way he said it, with this little smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, told me everything I needed to know about what had happened to Stephanie Walsh and the others. I turned the key and the Explorer roared to life, but the younger guy had already moved behind my car, standing directly in my rear path with that duffel bag at his feet, grinning at me through the rearview mirror. The older man was still at my window, now tapping on it with one knuckle slow and rhythmic, like he had all the time in the world. "Here's the thing," he said, loud enough for me to hear through the glass. "You can leave, sure, but we know this road better than you do. We know every pullout, every blind curve, every spot where cell phones don't work. That text you sent your sister? Mile marker 127. We know exactly where you'll be for the next 3 hours." My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I forced myself to think. The younger one behind me was the immediate problem. I couldn't back up without hitting him, and he knew it. But he was also scrawny, maybe 130 soaking wet, and standing way too close to my bumper. I slammed the Explorer into reverse and gunned it, not hard enough to run him over, but hard enough to clip him with the bumper and send him sprawling sideways into the gravel. He yelped and rolled, the duffel bag spilling open, and I caught a glimpse of rope, duct tape, and what looked like women's clothing scattered across the ground. The older man lunged for my door handle, but I was already shifting into drive, tires spinning on the gravel as I peeled out of there. In my side mirror, I saw him running for the tree line, probably heading for whatever vehicle they had hidden back there, while the younger one was still on the ground, clutching his knee. I hit the highway doing 60 and kept accelerating, my whole body shaking now that the adrenaline was catching up with me. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my hands were trembling so bad I dropped it between the seats. When I finally fished it out at 70 miles per hour, I had no signal. Just like he'd said, there were dead zones all along this stretch. I kept driving, checking my mirrors obsessively, waiting to see headlights closing in behind me. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and nothing. But I knew they were coming. They had to be coming. The highway ahead curved through a narrow canyon, rock walls on one side and a drop-off on the other, and I realized this was exactly the kind of place he'd been talking about. Nowhere to turn around, nowhere to pull off, just a perfect bottleneck where they could box me in. That's when I saw the headlights in my mirror coming up fast, a lifted pickup truck eating up the distance between us like my Explorer was standing still. It had those LED light bars that basically turn night into day, and even from half a mile back, they were blinding in my mirrors. I pushed the Explorer harder, hitting 85 on a road that wasn't meant for more than 55, tires squealing around every curve. The truck stayed right on me, close enough now that I could see two silhouettes in the cab. They could have rammed me easily, sent me flying off into the ravine, but they were hanging back just enough to keep me panicked, keep me driving reckless. Then I saw the second set of headlights ahead, coming toward me in the opposite lane but moving suspiciously slow. Another truck, this one with a plow attachment on the front, and I realized with perfect clarity what was about to happen. They were going to box me in, force me to stop, and nobody would ever know what happened to me. I'd just be another flyer on that board, another girl who disappeared on the Sterling Highway. But then something else appeared in the distance, flashing blue and red lights coming up behind the truck that was chasing me, moving faster than any of us. A state trooper, probably running speed enforcement on the highway, had clocked the truck behind me doing 90 plus. The pickup that had been hunting me suddenly hit its brakes, trying to look innocent. But it was too late. The trooper was already on him, sirens wailing. The truck ahead with the plow suddenly veered off onto a side road I hadn't even seen, disappearing into the forest. I kept driving, still shaking, watching in my mirror as the trooper forced the pickup to pull over. 20 minutes later, when I finally got signal again near Sterling, I called 911 and told them everything. They found the rest area right where I'd said, found the scattered contents of the duffel bag, found tire tracks leading to that old logging road. But the men were gone, probably scattered the moment that trooper showed up. The police also found something else though, fresh disturbed earth about 50 yards into the woods, in a cleared area that looked like it had been used before. They wouldn't tell me exactly what they found there, but I saw the news later about the remains of 3 women being discovered near mile marker 127. Stephanie Walsh was one of them. They never caught those men, as far as I know, though they did issue warnings about traveling alone on that stretch of highway. I made it to Homer that night, pulled into my cousin's driveway around 8 p.m., and broke down sobbing in her arms. I stayed for 2 weeks instead of 4 days, and when I finally drove back to Anchorage, I took the long way around through Seward, adding 3 hours to the trip. I still have nightmares about that man's face at my window, about what would have happened if that trooper hadn't shown up when he did. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, using different rest stops, waiting for other women traveling alone who just need to stretch their legs. I've been running long-haul routes for years, and nights on empty highways don't usually get to me. That evening was different, though. I was hauling up north with a refrigerated trailer, keeping my eyes on the endless blacktop ahead. The only sound inside the cab was the low hum of the engine and the occasional rattle from the dash. No radio, no chatter, just me, a thermos of burnt coffee, and the steady pulse of the headlights slicing through the dark. Traffic was non-existent out there. You can drive for an hour and not see another soul, so when a set of headlights appeared behind me, it caught me off guard. At first I thought it was another trucker catching up, but the way those lights sat glued to my rearview mirror made me tense up. I eased back on the throttle, giving them room to pass, but instead they flicked their high beams at me, bright, blinding, like a warning shot. Mile after mile they stuck right on my bumper. I tried speeding up, tried slowing down, but every time I touched the brakes even slightly, those brights hit me again, white hot in the mirror. It wasn't the usual hurry up kind of flash either. It felt deliberate, like they wanted me uncomfortable, like they wanted me to know they were there. My palms started sweating against the wheel, and I couldn't shake the thought that whoever was back there wasn't just another driver trying to get by. Eventually, I spotted one of those small gravel pull-offs, just a cut in the road where truckers can stop to check their loads or let faster vehicles pass. Relieved, I signaled and eased the rig over, expecting the car to roar past me. Instead, I heard their tires crunch onto the gravel right behind me. The engine cut, the lights went black, and before I could even process it, 2 doors slammed shut. 2 men stepped out and began walking toward my cab, each holding something long in their hands. From the height of my cab, I had a clear view of them, silhouettes moving slow but steady across the gravel. One wore a baseball cap pulled low. The other had a hood tightened around his face, shadowing it. The glow from my clearance lights caught something metallic in their hands, long, thin shapes that could have been crowbars, pipes, maybe even rifles. My throat went dry, and all I could hear was the tick of the cooling engine mixed with their crunching footsteps. I debated locking the doors, but the truth was they were already locked. Always are when I'm alone on stretches like that. What scared me wasn't the thought of them trying the handle. It was that they seemed so calm about approaching a 70,000-pound rig like it was nothing. That calmness made me realize this wasn't random. They had a plan, and whatever they were carrying wasn't for show. I slid my phone closer, but service bars out there flicker in and out like ghosts. They reached the driver's side first, standing just far enough back that I couldn't make out their faces clearly. One of them tapped the side of the cab with the end of his object, hollow, echoing bangs that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Then the other circled toward the passenger side, his shadow stretching across the gravel in the beam of my lights. It felt like being surrounded, even though there were only 2 of them. Every instinct in me screamed not to open that door, not to roll down that window, nothing. I flicked my high beams forward, bathing the empty road ahead in white, half hoping another driver might appear. Nothing. Just silence, dark forest pressed against the highway, and 2 figures who didn't belong there. That's when the man at my door leaned close, his face just a blur behind the glass, and raised his hand. Instead of knocking again, he pressed a sheet of paper flat against the window. From where I sat, I could make out black block letters scrawled across it, messy and uneven. "Step out." I didn't move. My grip tightened on the wheel as if that alone could anchor me. The man at the passenger side tried the handle once, then again, harder this time. The cab shook faintly, but those locks held. I leaned toward the air horn switch and blasted it, the sound tearing through the still night. For a second, both men froze. They weren't expecting noise that loud out there, and I saw them exchange a quick glance before the one at my door slammed the paper against the glass again. When they didn't back off, I dropped the rig into gear. Gravel sprayed under the tires as I jerked the truck forward. The man at the driver's side stumbled back, hitting the hood of his own car. The other ran around in front of my lights, waving his arm as if to block me, but I wasn't stopping. I swung wide, the trailer kicking up dust, and roared back onto the highway. In the mirror, I saw them scramble into their car, headlights flaring to life again. They followed, but my rig had weight and power. I pushed the speed higher than I usually would with a full load, every muscle tight with adrenaline. For miles, their beams stayed glued behind me, sometimes pulling closer, sometimes hanging back. Then, without warning, they turned off down a side road, vanishing into the dark like they had never been there at all. No brake lights, no signal, just gone. The highway ahead looked endless, but for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe again. By the time I reached the next truck stop, hours later, I pulled in shaking and exhausted. I walked straight to the counter and asked the clerk if anyone else had reported strange cars harassing drivers out there. He just stared at me like he'd heard this before but didn't want to say it out loud. I never found out who those men were or what they planned to do if I'd stepped out of my cab. All I know is that I trust those locked doors more than ever, and I haven't stopped in one of those lonely pull-offs since. It was supposed to be a short assignment, nothing more than a couple of weeks filling in at a small clinic for a nurse who had gone to visit family. I had just finished my regular rotation in Anchorage and thought the change of scenery would be refreshing, maybe even an adventure. The place was a remote village tucked deep into Alaska's wilderness, a cluster of modest houses and a single dusty airstrip surrounded by endless white. The only way in or out was by plane, and when the small aircraft dropped me off, I remember the silence feeling almost physical, like the snow had swallowed every familiar sound of the world I knew. The clinic itself was a squat wooden building, with peeling blue paint and a roof that sagged slightly under layers of old snow. Inside, it was simple but functional. 2 exam rooms, a small storage area, and a back door that led out into an alley where the wind funneled like a whistle through the night. The locals weren't unfriendly, but they were quiet, reserved. They greeted me politely at the general store or when someone came for medicine, but they never lingered, never made small talk. I assumed it was just the way of people who lived in such isolation. 3 days into my stay, the storm arrived. Heavy snow piled against the clinic windows, rattling them in their frames, and the sky turned the kind of gray that made you lose track of time. Flights were grounded indefinitely, and the tiny radio in the clinic buzzed with static more than voices. Supplies were limited, and though I wasn't worried at first, the empty shelves in the storage room began to gnaw at me. What bothered me more, though, was how quickly the village seemed to retreat into itself. Doors stayed shut, curtains drawn, and even the faint sounds of children outside disappeared. It felt like the entire settlement had decided to wait the storm out in silence. That night, while I was inventorying what was left of the gauze and antibiotics, I heard it. A soft knock at the clinic's back door. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. 3 short raps spaced evenly. I assumed it might be someone needing help, but when I stepped into the hallway and looked through the small window in the door, the snow-covered alley was empty. No footprints, no lantern light, nothing. I told myself it must have been the storm playing tricks, but the sound had been too precise, too human. The next morning I checked again behind the clinic, half expecting to find prints in the snow that I'd missed. The ground was smooth, untouched, as if the storm had erased every trace of movement. I mentioned the knocking to one of the elders who came in to collect some aspirin, but he just shook his head, eyes fixed on the floor, and muttered that nobody had reason to be out at night. His avoidance made my chest tighten more than the storm itself. People here clearly knew something I didn't, but no one wanted to explain. That evening, the sound returned. This time louder, sharper, 5 knocks instead of 3. I had the lantern burning on the desk and could see the frost collecting at the edges of the back window. I forced myself to walk the hallway again, heart racing with each step, and peeked through the glass. The alley looked exactly the same, nothing but blowing snow and the warped shadow of the utility pole. I opened the door just a crack, expecting the wind to rush in, but the air outside was eerily still. The knocking had stopped the moment my hand touched the knob. By the 4th night, it wasn't just knocking anymore. I heard the crunch of footsteps circling the building, slow and deliberate, as though someone was pacing a wide circle around the clinic. The sound would fade, then return on the other side, almost like whoever it was wanted me to know they were making a full loop. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to pinpoint the rhythm, and it seemed to go on for hours. When I finally worked up the nerve to swing open the back door, the footsteps stopped instantly, leaving me with nothing but my own ragged breathing and the hiss of the lantern. Sleep became impossible. I sat awake in the exam chair with a blanket around my shoulders, waiting for the inevitable sounds. I began noticing that the villagers avoided eye contact even more. When I asked a young man at the store if anyone had been walking near the clinic at night, he backed away, as if I'd accused him of something. Their silence felt heavier than the snow pressing against the windows. It wasn't just that they didn't want to help. It was like they were pretending not to hear what I did, as if acknowledging it might make it worse. On the 5th night, I placed a metal tray against the inside of the back door, hoping that if someone pushed or knocked again, it would clatter loud enough to wake the whole village. Around midnight, the familiar tapping began, slow, measured, like a code. The tray rattled once, then silence. I sat there gripping the lantern, certain that whoever had been circling the clinic knew exactly what I was trying to do. The air inside felt thick, the kind of pressure that makes your ears ache. I couldn't stop staring at the door, waiting for the handle to move. The storm outside showed no sign of breaking. Snow had buried half the back alley, piling nearly to the window. Yet the footsteps kept returning, somehow steady, crunching across drifts that should have swallowed a person whole. At one point, I swore I saw a faint shape beyond the frosted glass, a figure standing still, facing the door. By the time I wiped the window clear with my sleeve, it was gone. No footprints, no shadow. Just the endless white pressing close against the walls. By the 6th morning, I'd had enough. I walked to the elder's house and demanded answers. My voice cracked from exhaustion, but I didn't care. The oldest man finally met my eyes and said in a flat tone, "The clinic has its own history. When the wind carries, you don't answer what you hear." That was all. No explanation, no comfort. Just that one sentence. I realized then that everyone had known this would happen. They had left me to face it alone because they believed silence was safer than acknowledgement. The storm finally cleared a day later, and the plane came to take me back. I didn't look behind me as I boarded. The village, the clinic, the strange quiet of the nights. All of it felt like a weight I couldn't shake. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night certain I've heard that same deliberate knocking 3 times, then 5. I'll never know who or what stood outside that door, but I'm certain of one thing. If I had opened it wider, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. I left the service with my head full of noise. Civilian life was quieter, but my thoughts never really shut off. Hiking had always been my reset button, and I figured a few days in the Alaskan backcountry would help straighten me out. No schedules, no radio chatter, just my boots crunching on dirt and the kind of silence you can't find anywhere else. I packed light, took my old shotgun more out of habit than need, and drove out to a trailhead I'd only heard about from a guy at a local bait shop. The first hours were uneventful. Just endless ridgelines and spruce, the kind of terrain that makes you feel like you're walking through a postcard. My legs ached in that good way, the one that tells you you've put real distance between yourself and everything familiar. Around late afternoon, I cut through a stretch of trees and caught the smell of wood smoke. At first, I figured it was another hiker ahead of me. Out there, though, that's not a smell you expect. Pushing deeper into the stand of trees, I came across a small clearing with a tent, a ring of stones blackened from a recent fire, and food still sitting on a metal grate above glowing coals. A pot of something that looked like beans was bubbling quietly, like whoever had been there had just stepped away a minute earlier. But the place was deserted. No backpacks, no boots, not even a water bottle lying around. Just the campsite and that strange sense of interruption, as if time had been paused mid-scene. I called out once, more out of courtesy than concern. "Hello? Anybody here?" But the trees gave me nothing back. It didn't sit right with me. Campers don't just leave hot food unattended in bear country. It looked too fresh, too recent. I didn't touch anything, just noted the spot and kept moving, telling myself maybe they'd wandered off for water. Still, the back of my neck itched the entire time I put distance between myself and that fire. By dusk, I had picked a flat patch of ground near a creek and set up my tent. The air carried that sharp mountain chill, and the light dropped faster than I expected. I cooked a quick meal, nothing fancy, and tried to settle in. But the silence wasn't the kind that comforts. It pressed in from every direction. Even the usual forest sounds seemed dulled, like the world was holding its breath. That image of the bubbling beans kept cycling through my mind, reminding me that someone had left in a hurry, without explanation. Around midnight, I was half asleep when the first sound reached me. A whistle, high and almost playful, threaded through the trees. It wasn't the wind, and it sure as hell wasn't a bird. The sound hung for a few seconds before cutting off abruptly. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for the shotgun beside me. Then came the crack of a branch snapping, then another. Whoever was out there wasn't being careful. They wanted me to know. The whistling started again, but this time from a different direction. It moved, circling. A low laugh followed, faint but unmistakable. My training kicked in. I steadied my breathing, listened carefully, tried to map their positions in the dark. There wasn't just one, at least 2, maybe 3. They shifted around me, closing the circle, breaking branches as if mocking the idea of stealth. Every nerve in my body screamed that I wasn't being stumbled upon. I was being targeted. I slid the shotgun across my lap and kept the barrel aimed toward the tent's zipper. My finger rested near the trigger guard as I fought the urge to yell out. If I spoke, I'd confirm my exact position. Instead, I killed my headlamp, plunging everything into black. The fabric of the tent felt like tissue paper between me and whatever was out there. My ears worked overtime, tracking their movements. Step, crack, whistle. Step, crack, whistle. They were hunting me and they weren't in any rush. At one point, a rock struck the side of my tent, hard enough to make the fabric shudder. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't kids messing around or another hiker wandering drunk. They were testing me, trying to rattle me into making a mistake. My grip tightened on the shotgun. I racked a shell quietly, just enough for the metallic click to carry through the trees. The sounds outside paused, like they were listening. Then the whistle came again, closer this time, mocking, deliberate. I couldn't spend the whole night pinned inside a nylon bag. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and crawled out, shotgun ready. The forest was pitch black, no moon, no stars, just a wall of trees pressing in on every side. My breath fogged in the cold air, and every exhale felt too loud. I kept the barrel moving with my eyes, searching for movement. That's when I caught it. A faint silhouette slipping between two spruces, too tall and too fluid to be mistaken for an animal. Another figure moved just behind it. I shouted once, loud and sharp, warning them to back off. The woods swallowed my voice, but the whistling finally stopped. A few seconds later came the sound of retreating footsteps, moving fast through the underbrush. I didn't chase. I stood there for what felt like an hour, shotgun leveled, before forcing myself back into the tent. Sleep never came. I waited for dawn like a man waiting for a verdict, every sound amplified, every shadow suspect. By first light, I broke camp and retraced my steps out of the mountains. The abandoned campsite was still there, but the pot of beans was overturned, blackened against the ashes, as if someone had stamped it out during the night. No footprints I could follow, no sign of who had been there. Just silence. I carried myself back to the trailhead without stopping, shotgun in my hands the entire way. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'm certain of one thing. I was never meant to leave that mountain alive.